The way the condensation was literally dripping off Brenda's iced latte while she yelled at a 6-year-old was this is exactly the kind of petty tyranny that made me start Sovereign Justice in the first place. Let's just dive right into it.
Are you seriously writing a citation for a 6-year-old? The red and blue lights of the Boca Raton police cruiser were bouncing off the pristine, eggshell white stucco of my house, casting these weird, chaotic shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. It was 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening in late July. The air was practically soup, that thick, suffocating Florida humidity that makes your clothes stick to your skin the second you step outside. And there I was, standing in my driveway in athletic shorts and a t-shirt covered in spaghetti sauce, staring down the barrel of the most absurd standoff in the history of suburban America. Down on the concrete, right near the edge of the street, was the scene of the crime. It was a unicorn. Well, it was supposed to be a unicorn. My daughter Chloe is 6, and her grasp of equine anatomy is, let's say, abstract. It was a lopsided, neon pink and aggressively green chalk drawing with a horn that looked more like a bent traffic cone. It was harmless. It was cute. It was also apparently a threat to the very fabric of society. Standing over this pastel masterpiece was Brenda. Brenda was the president of the Boca del Vista Homeowners Association, and she wore that title like a 4-star general's uniform. Tonight, she was outfitted in her standard patrol gear, a crisp white tennis skirt, a visor that shielded her eyes from the setting sun, and a clipboard gripped so tightly in her manicured hands that her knuckles were white. In her other hand was her weapon of choice, an iced latte that was sweating profusely in the muggy air. And then, there was Officer Miller. Poor, exhausted Officer Miller. He was leaning against the front quarter panel of his squad car, looking like a man who was profoundly rethinking every life choice that had led him to this exact driveway. He had his thumbs hooked into his duty belt, his head tilted back slightly as if asking the heavens for a localized meteor strike. "Ma'am," Officer Miller said, his voice completely devoid of any emotion other than profound weariness. "It is chalk. It is Crayola washable street chalk. The radar says we are getting a thunderstorm at roughly 4:15 tomorrow afternoon. Nature is going to handle this." Brenda scoffed. It was this sharp, practiced sound that she usually reserved for people who left their garbage cans at the curb an hour past the designated retrieval time. "Officer, I don't think you understand the severity of the situation," she snapped, gesturing wildly at the lopsided pink unicorn with her latte. "This is an unauthorized property alteration. It is a direct violation of Section 4, Article 2 of the Boca del Vista bylaws regarding temporary markings and graffiti. If we let this slide, what's next? People painting their mailboxes neon orange? Anarchy? It sets a precedent." I stepped in front of Chloe, who was hiding behind my leg, clutching a half-eaten stick of blue chalk like it was contraband. "Brenda, she is 6 years old," I said, trying to keep my voice level. She was drawing a magical horse. "Are you going to dust her juice box for fingerprints next? Call the FBI? Demand a forensic analysis of the driveway?" "Ignorance of the bylaws is not an excuse for breaking them," Brenda shot back, her eyes narrowing beneath her visor. "When you bought a home in this community, you signed a legally binding contract to uphold the aesthetic cohesion of this neighborhood. That," she pointed a trembling, manicured finger at the chalk, "is not cohesive. It is an eyesore. I demand that a report be filed." Officer Miller sighed. It was a long, rattling sigh that seemed to originate from the very depths of his soul. He pushed himself off his cruiser and adjusted his vest. "Listen to me very carefully, folks," he said, his tone shifting into the authoritative drone of a cop who is entirely done with the conversation. "I am not writing a police report for a chalk drawing. I am not citing a kindergartner for vandalism. There is no crime here. This is a civil matter. It is an HOA matter. If you want to handle this, you handle it through your board. But if either of you calls 911 again, because a child is playing in their own driveway, I am going to start handing out citations for misuse of the emergency dispatch system. Do we have an understanding? Brenda's mouth dropped open. She looked like she had just been slapped. But the property values? Have a pleasant evening, ma'am, Miller interrupted, turning on his heel. He gave me a brief, sympathetic nod, climbed into his cruiser, and killed the flashing lights. As he drove away, the neighborhood suddenly felt very quiet, save for the hum of central air conditioning units and the distant hum of traffic on Palmetto Park Road. I looked at Brenda. Brenda looked at me. The air between us was practically vibrating with hostility. "Well," I said, offering a tight, entirely fake smile. "Glad we got that sorted out. Come on, Chloe. Well, let's go inside and wash your hands. It's almost bath time." Brenda didn't say a word. She just stared at me, her eyes cold and calculating. She flipped a page on her clipboard, pulled a pen out of her pocket, and started writing furiously. She didn't say goodnight. She didn't issue another warning. She just marched up my paved walkway, slapped a piece of paper against my custom mahogany front door, and marched away, her tennis shoes squeaking against the concrete. I waited until she was out of sight before I walked up to the door and pulled the paper off. It was a bright pink carbon copy slip. Violation: Temporary markings and graffiti. Section 4, Article 2. Fine assessed: $500. Remediation required: immediate removal of unauthorized markings. $500 for a chalk unicorn. I stood there in the humid night air, staring at the pink slip, and I felt this slow, simmering heat start to rise in my chest. It wasn't just anger. It was a deep, fundamental offense to my sense of logic. I am an architect. I design commercial structures for a living. I spend my days navigating building codes, zoning regulations, and structural engineering permits. I deal with municipal bureaucracy on a massive scale. I read legal codes for fun. I understand the necessity of rules, but I also understand when rules are being weaponized by petty tyrants with a god complex. Brenda had messed with the wrong dad. She hadn't just fined me. She had challenged me. And in my world, when someone throws the rulebook at you, you don't just dodge it. You pick it up, you find the binding, and you beat them over the head with it. I ushered Chloe inside. Yes, helped her scrub the neon chalk dust off her hands, read her a bedtime story about a bear who loses his hat, and waited until she was fast asleep. Then, I walked downstairs, went into my study, and closed the door. My study is my sanctuary. It has floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a heavy oak desk, and exactly 0 pastel colors. I walked over to the small bar cart in the corner, poured myself 3 fingers of Lagavulin 16. Neat, because this situation required peat and smoke, and sat down at my desk. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out the beast. The Boca del Vista Homeowners Association Bylaws and Covenants. It was a massive, 3-inch thick black leather binder. It weighed about 8 pounds. It was 400 pages of the most restrictive, soul-crushing, hyper-specific micromanagement ever committed to paper. I cracked it open, just took a sip of the scotch, and let the burn settle in my chest. If Brenda wanted to play the technicality game, we were going to play. I needed a loophole. I needed a way to utterly humiliate her, to strip away her power, and to do it in a way that was entirely, 100%, legally bulletproof. I didn't just want to beat the fine. I wanted to build a fortress that she couldn't penetrate. I started reading. I read past the rules stating that garbage cans could only be visible from the street for exactly 43 minutes before and after the arrival of the sanitation truck. I read past the mandate that all lawn grass must be maintained at a height of precisely 2.5 inches, with an allowable variance of only 1/8 of an inch. I read through the approved color palettes for exterior trim, and which basically consisted of Depression Gray, Institution Beige, and Surrender White. Around 1 a.m., my eyes were burning, but I found it. The clause she had used against me. Rule 42A. Temporary markings. Under no circumstances shall temporary markings, including but not limited to chalk, temporary paint, tape, or signage, be applied to driveways, walkways, or exterior walls visible from the street without prior written consent from the Architectural Review Board. Fair enough. But the beautiful thing about legal documents is that they are written by lawyers, and lawyers love exceptions. They love defining what something is by defining what it isn't. I flipped back to the section governing driveways. Rule 18, C. Driveway maintenance and alteration. Driveways must be maintained in a clean, uniform condition. However, once professional driveway resurfacing, sealing, and decorative concrete treatments are permitted, provided that the base colors are restricted to grayscale tones, black, white, and gray, and a formal schematic is submitted and approved by the Architectural Review Board. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. Professional driveway resurfacing. Decorative concrete treatments restricted to grayscale tones. My mind started spinning. If I just painted the driveway gray, she'd win. If I painted a gray picture, she'd just classify it as unauthorized graffiti and force me to power wash it. The HOA bylaws gave the board the power to mandate the removal of anything they deemed aesthetically displeasing. They had ultimate authority over the physical appearance of the property. Unless there was a higher authority. And I slammed my laptop open. The scotch was kicking in, lubricating the gears in my brain. Local HOA bylaws are basically private contracts. They supersede a lot of things, but they don't supersede municipal code. Municipal code doesn't supersede state law, and state law doesn't supersede federal law. I needed a federal shield. I brought up Cornell Law's Legal Information Institute database and started typing furiously. I was looking for federal protections regarding property alteration. I looked at the FCC's OTARD rules, over-the-air reception devices, which protect your right to install a satellite dish regardless of HOA rules. But I couldn't build a satellite dish over my whole driveway. I looked at the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005. I could paint a massive grayscale American flag. But Brenda would just argue it wasn't a flag, it was a painting of a flag, and demand it removed. I needed something bulletproof, something related to art, something related to creation. And then, at 2:34 a.m., I found it, the holy grail of malicious compliance. 17 U.S. Code, Section 106A, Rights of Certain Authors to Attribution and Integrity, better known as the Visual Artists' Rights Act of 1990. VARA. I read the text, and I swear angels started singing in my study. VARA is a specific provision of federal copyright law. It grants the creator of a work of visual art the right to prevent the intentional distortion, mutilation, or other modification of that work. But here was the kicker, as the absolute nuclear option buried in paragraph A, 3, B. The author of a work of visual art shall have the right to prevent any destruction of a work of recognized stature, and any intentional or grossly negligent destruction of that work is a violation of that right. I read it again. If a piece of art achieves recognized stature, meaning it is acknowledged by the art community and society at large as being culturally or artistically significant, federal law prohibits its destruction. Even if the art is attached to a building, even if it's on private property, you cannot destroy it without the artist's explicit consent. I brought up case law to verify it. The 5 Points case in New York. A real estate developer had whitewashed a bunch of famous graffiti on his own buildings to prepare for demolition. The artists sued under VARA, as the courts ruled that the graffiti had achieved recognized stature. The developer had to pay the artists $6.7 million in statutory damages. Federal judges don't mess around with VARA. I took another sip of Lagavulin. The plan was crystallizing in my mind, forming into something beautiful and terrible. Step 1. I pay the $500 fine. It hurts, but it lulls Brenda into a false sense of security. It makes her think she won. Step 2. I submit a vague but entirely accurate architectural request under Rule 18C for a grayscale decorative concrete sealant treatment. She rubber stamps it because it fits the color constraints. Step 3. I hire an artist. But not just any artist. If I hire some kid from the local community college, Brenda will just argue the work lacks recognized stature, bulldoze past the federal law, and fine me into oblivion while the case is tied up in civil court. I needed someone untouchable. I needed someone whose mere signature instantly elevated a piece of concrete to a federally protected cultural artifact. I needed a world-renowned street artist. Now, you are probably asking yourself the same rhetorical question I asked the empty room. How does a dad in Boca Raton, Florida, get a world-famous, internationally recognized street artist to fly out and paint his driveway just to spite an HOA president? The answer is surprisingly simple. You find an artist who hates authority, conventional rules, and the sanitization of public spaces just as much as you do. You find an artist whose entire brand is built on subverting expectations and mocking the establishment. I pulled out my phone. I have clients in a lot of weird places. So a few years ago, I designed a high-security, climate-controlled subterranean vault for an eccentric billionaire in Miami who collected subversive contemporary art. During that project, I had to coordinate with several high-end authentication agencies to ensure the environmental controls met their specific standards for preservation. One of those agencies was based in the UK. They were notoriously secretive, incredibly difficult to deal with, and their primary function was authenticating the works of a specific, anonymous street artist. The agency was called Pest Control. I drafted an email. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a pitch. I laid out the situation. The overzealous HOA, the absurd fine over a child's chalk drawing, the specific constraints of Rule 18C, and the legal trap I was setting with the Visual Artists' Rights Act, when I offered to cover all travel, all materials, and a substantial, anonymous donation to a charity of their choice. I hit send at 3:15 a.m. I didn't expect a reply. It was a shot in the dark, a Hail Mary thrown into the void of the international art scene. I closed my laptop, finished my scotch, and went up to bed, feeling a weird mix of exhaustion and absolute electric anticipation. I woke up the next morning, groggy and nursing a mild headache. I made Chloe breakfast, got her ready for camp, and sat down at the kitchen island with my phone. I opened my email app. There was one new message in my inbox. The sender was an encrypted alphanumeric address. The subject line was blank. I opened it. The email contained exactly 2 sentences. The canvas must be primed, acid-washed, and sealed with a high-adhesion industrial bonding agent before arrival. We will be there on the 14th. I stared at the screen. I read it 3 times. It was happening. The trap was set. Brenda thought she was fighting a war over a $500 fine and some washable chalk. She had absolutely no idea that she was about to go toe-to-toe with the United States federal government and the most famous subversive artist on the planet. I honestly can't stop thinking about the way Gary, my contractor, just stared at that rusty pressure washer trailer like it was a sentient being trying to ruin his life. It was so perfectly chaotic. I mean, seeing a guy who's spent 30 years in the Florida sun get genuinely confused by a simple art project was probably the most sovereign justice moment of the whole year. Check this out. The next morning, I didn't waste any time. I put on my best I am a defeated suburban dad face, shoulders slumped, eyes a little tired, maybe a slightly too tight polo shirt, and drove down to the Boca del Vista HOA main office. It was located in a building that looked exactly like a bank, but smelled exclusively like lavender-scented bleach and ancient resentment. Mrs. Higgins was behind the desk. She was 75 if she was a day, with hair the color of a fresh nickel and glasses that were roughly the size of satellite dishes. She looked up at me with this look of profound, practiced disappointment. "I'm here to pay a fine," I said, sliding the pink slip across the marble counter like a gambler tossing his last chip. "And I'd like to submit an application for a driveway preservation project." She squinted at the slip, then at me. "The chalk incident? Brenda said you were quite vocal about the unicorn." "I've seen the error of my ways, Mrs. Higgins," I lied, my voice dripping with fake humility. "I realized that the aesthetic cohesion of the neighborhood is paramount. I want to do things right. I want to seal my driveway so it's easier to clean. No more chalk issues. I've even prepared the schematic." I handed her the $500 check and a 2-page packet I'd stayed up until dawn creating. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic obfuscation. I had used my architectural software to create a series of grayscale geometric sealant patterns. On paper, it looked like a standard, boring, high-end gray driveway. Well, I'd used technical terms like polyaspartic topcoat and monochromatic tonal mapping. To the untrained eye, or the eye of a woman who just wanted me to go away, it looked like I was spending $10,000 to make my driveway look like a slightly nicer parking lot. "Grayscale?" she asked, her finger tracing the line on the form. "Only black, white, and varying shades of slate gray, per Rule 18C, I replied. "Very professional. Very uniform." She stamped the check, stamped the application, and gave me a little nod. "I'll have Brenda review this afternoon. If it meets the color palette, there shouldn't be an issue. We like it when residents take initiative to maintain their property values." "Oh, I'm taking initiative, all right," I muttered as I walked out. By 4 p.m., I had a digital notification. Application approved. Permit number BV-9921-A. Brenda had signed it. I mean, she probably didn't even look at the schematic. She just saw grayscale and sealant and figured she had successfully bullied me into cleaning up my act. She thought she was getting a boring gray slab. Now, I had exactly 6 days before the 14th. I needed the prep crew. I called Gary. Gary was a man who looked like he was carved out of a piece of sun-dried beef jerky. He arrived at my house in a truck that had more rust than paint, hauling a trailer that looked like it had survived a war zone. Gary didn't believe in aesthetics. Gary believed in PSY and high-pressure steam. "You want me to do what now?" Gary asked, spitting a bit of sunflower seed shell onto the grass. He was looking at my driveway like I'd asked him to wash his truck with holy water. "I need an acid wash. Deep penetration. Worse than then, I need you to prime it with a high-adhesion bonding agent. Specifically this brand," I said, handing him a spec sheet from the pest control email. "And I need it done at night." Gary wiped sweat from his forehead with a grease-stained rag. "It's Florida, pal. I work at 6 a.m. so I don't die of heat stroke by noon. Why the hell do you want me here at midnight?" "Because," I said, leaning in like I was sharing a state secret, "the sealant is light-sensitive during the curing phase. If the bokeh sun hits it before it sets, the bond fails. Plus, my wife wants it to be a surprise for the kids. A big reveal." Gary looked at me like I was the biggest weirdo he'd ever met. "Rich people are something else, I swear. It's gonna cost you double for the night shift. Triple," I said. "But I want it perfect. No streaks, no missed spots. I want this concrete so clean you could perform surgery on it." "Triple?" Gary's eyes lit up. "I'll bring the industrial steamer. You'll be able to see your reflection in the pores of the rock, boss." The next 3 nights were a blur of high-pressure water and chemical fumes. Gary and his crew were like a frantic, noisy pit crew for a very slow race. They were out there under portable floodlights, the roar of the pressure washer echoing through the quiet streets of Boca del Vista. Naturally, Brenda showed up on night 2. She was wearing a silk robe and holding a flashlight like a riot baton. "What is this noise?" she shrieked over the hum of the generator. "It is 11:30 p.m. There are noise ordinances, Gausser." I walked over to the edge of the lawn, a cup of coffee in my hand. Just following the manufacturer's specs for the approved sealant, Brenda. Like I said, it's a temperature-sensitive application. I'm just trying to make sure I don't violate Rule 18C by having a non-uniform finish. I'm doing this for the neighborhood." She looked at Gary, who was currently wearing a respirator and blasting the concrete with a jet of steam that looked like it could cut through a tank. She looked at the permit I had taped to my front window. She couldn't do a thing. I was literally following the rules she had used to fine me. "This better be done by morning," she huffed, retreated back into her fortress of solitude. By the night of the 13th, the driveway was a pristine white-gray expanse of perfectly prepped concrete. It was beautiful in its emptiness. It was a 600-square-foot canvas waiting for a master. At 2 a.m. on the 14th, a nondescript white van pulled into the cul-de-sac. It didn't have any markings. It didn't have a ladder rack. It just looked like a delivery van that had lost its way. It backed into my driveway, and 2 figures stepped out. Both were wearing dark hoodies, despite the 80-degree heat. One was shorter, carrying a duffel bag that rattled with the unmistakable sound of spray cans. The other was taller, holding a tablet and a series of large, rolled-up stencils. "Mr. Ibrahim?" the taller one asked. He had a thick Bristol accent that sounded wildly out of place in suburban Florida. "That's me," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. "The driveway is prepped. Gary's bonding agent is dry. It's all yours." The shorter figure pulled back his hood just enough for me to see a pair of sharp, intelligent eyes. "Him." He didn't say a word. He just walked to the center of the driveway, knelt down, and touched the concrete. He looked at the street, then at Brenda's house across the way, then back at the canvas. "The girl," he said softly, looking at the lady with the clipboard. "Exactly," I whispered. They moved with a precision that was honestly terrifying. This wasn't just graffiti. It was a tactical operation. They laid out the first layer of stencils, huge, complex cutouts that they weighted down with small sandbags. The tall guy held a portable LED light that was shielded so the beam only hit the ground, while the artist began to work. The sound was a rhythmic, hypnotic shuck, shuck, shuck of the cans being shaken, followed by the long, controlled hiss of the spray. They weren't using normal paint. They were using a specialized, two-part industrial epoxy that had been tinted into 5 different shades of gray. This stuff wasn't coming off with a power washer. It wasn't coming off with a jackhammer. It was literally becoming part of the driveway's molecular structure. I sat on my porch, shielded by the shadows of the bougainvillea, and watched a masterpiece take shape. The image was stunning. On the left side, near the garage, was a life-sized stencil of a little girl, clearly modeled after Chloe, though her face was slightly obscured. She was holding a single, glowing piece of chalk. She looked small, innocent, and defiant. On the right side, closer to the street, was the antagonist. A towering, monochromatic woman in a rigid power suit, clutching a clipboard that looked like a weapon. The woman was leaning over, her shadow cast in deep, a dark gray across the pavement of the painting, her mouth twisted in a silent, ugly snarl. But the brilliance was in the perspective. From the street, the mural looked 3D. It looked like the woman was actually standing there, hovering over the driveway. Between the girl and the woman, the artist had painted a massive, hyper-realistic hopscotch grid that looked like it was carved into the stone. "Done," the artist said at 4:45 a.m. They packed their bags with the same silent efficiency. The van's engine turned over, a low rumble in the pre-dawn stillness. The tall man handed me a small, embossed card. "The certificate of authenticity will be mailed to your attorney's office within 48 hours, he said. "Do not let them touch it for at least 6 hours. The epoxy needs the morning humidity to reach full hardness." "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with genuine awe. "You have no idea what this means to me." The artist looked at me from the passenger seat. He gave a small 2-finger salute. "Keep drawing, mate." The van disappeared into the Florida fog just as the first hint of gray light began to bleed into the eastern sky. I stood there, looking at my driveway, and I knew. I knew that by noon, this piece of property would be worth more than the house it was attached to. I knew that Brenda was about to experience a level of legal pain she couldn't even imagine. I went inside, made a double espresso, and sat by the front window. I didn't have to wait long. At 6:30 a.m., Brenda's front door opened. She was in her jogging gear, a neon pink tracksuit that made her look like a frantic highlighter. She stepped onto her porch, did a few perfunctory stretches, and then she turned her head. I saw the exact moment her brain stopped working. She froze mid-stretch, her leg hooked over the porch railing. She stared. She blinked. She rubbed her eyes. She walked down her steps, across the street, and stopped at the edge of my property line. She looked like she was looking at an alien spacecraft that had landed in her cabbage patch. I stepped out onto my porch, leaning against the railing. "Morning, Brenda. Isn't the light beautiful this morning? Really brings out the highlights in the new sealant." Brenda's face began to turn a shade of red that I'm fairly certain isn't found in nature. What is this?" she stuttered, pointing a shaking hand at the mural. I approved a gray geometric treatment. This is a person. This is a girl. Is that me?" "It's an artistic interpretation of suburban life, Brenda," I said, taking a slow sip of my espresso. "In grayscale. Just like the permit required. It's a decorative concrete treatment, entirely uniform in color palette, very high-end." "It is graffiti!" she screamed, her voice cracking and waking up the neighbor's golden retriever. "It is unauthorized. I am calling the police. I am calling the board. I am getting a crew out here right now to blast this trash into the sewer." "You could do that," I said, my voice dropping into a calm, dangerous register. "But before you do, you might want to call the HOA's legal counsel. Ask them to look up a little something called the Visual Artists' Rights Act of 1990. It's a federal statute. 17 U.S. Code, Section 106A. Brenda wasn't listening. She was already fumbling with her phone, with her thumbs flying across the screen. "I don't care about your codes. I care about the rules of this community. You are in violation. You are so deep in violation you'll never see the light of day." Within 20 minutes, the blue lights were back. Officer Miller pulled up, looking even more sleep-deprived than he had a week ago. He stepped out of the car, looked at the driveway, and just stopped. He stayed there for a full minute, his mouth slightly open. "'Gay, sir," he said, not looking away from the mural. "Yes, officer? Is that a genuine Banksy on your driveway?" "I can neither confirm nor deny the identity of the artist, Officer Miller," I said, walking down the steps to meet him. "But I do have a certificate of authenticity from an internationally recognized agency. It's a work of recognized stature, a masterpiece, some might say." Brenda was vibrating with fury. "Officer, arrest him! He has defaced the neighborhood. He has mocked me. Look at that woman. That's clearly a caricature of me." Miller looked at the mural, then at Brenda, then back at the mural. A tiny, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Ma'am, I'm looking at your permit here. It says grayscale decorative concrete treatment. This is gray. It is on his private property. It is, by definition, a treatment of the concrete." "It's a picture!" "It's art, Brenda," Miller said, his voice regaining its weary authority. "And if this is who I think it is, this driveway is now a federal heritage site for the art world. I can't arrest a man for having a multi-million-dollar painting on his floor." "I will have it removed," Brenda shrieked. "I'll hire a crew. I'll do it myself." "Brenda," I said, stepping forward. "I'm going to say this once, and I want you to listen very carefully. This mural is protected under the Visual Artists' Rights Act. Under federal law, if you or the HOA intentionally mutilate or destroy a work of recognized stature, you are liable for statutory damages of up to $150,000 per violation, plus the actual market value of the work, which, in this case, is estimated to be somewhere in the 7-figure range. If you touch this driveway with so much as a wet rag, I will sue you. I will sue every member of the board individually, and I will sue this HOA until the only thing left of Boca del Vista is a pile of legal fees and regret." The silence that followed was heavy. The only sound was the distant chirping of a lawnmower and the heavy, ragged breathing of a woman who had finally realized she had run into a wall she couldn't scream her way through. Officer Miller looked at me and winked. "Well, looks like another civil matter. Have a nice day, folks. Try not to start any international art wars before lunch." He got back in his car and drove away. Brenda stood there, staring at the little girl with the chalk and the monstrous woman with the clipboard. She looked smaller now. She looked like she was starting to do the math. But Brenda was a creature of habit. And Brenda didn't like losing. She didn't like it one bit. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice low and trembling. "You think you're so smart. You think you can hide behind your little laws. Well, we'll see what the board says about recognized stature. We'll see how your art holds up when the heavy machinery arrives." She turned and marched back to her house. But for the first time, she didn't look like a general. She looked like a woman who was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. I went back inside and called my lawyer. "Hey, Marcus. Yeah, it's Gaser. Go ahead and file the preliminary injunction, and you might want to call the local news. I think Boca Raton is about to have a very interesting afternoon." The trap was fully set. Now I just had to wait for Brenda to trip the wire. I sat back, watched the sun hit the mural, and waited. I knew her. I knew her pride. I knew she couldn't stand the sight of that little girl looking at her every time she left her house. I knew she was going to try to blast it off. And that was exactly what I was counting on. I gave it exactly 4 hours before I had to leave the house. You can only stare at a masterpiece of petty revenge for so long before you need a sandwich, right? Plus, I knew Brenda. Brenda operated on a very specific suburban timeline. She wouldn't try anything while I was sitting on the porch drinking coffee. She was a coward at heart. She needed an opening. She needed me to leave. So, around 11 a.m., I made a very loud, very obvious show of packing Chloe into my SUV. I waved to Mrs. Gable across the street, backed out over my federally protected multi-million-dollar driveway, and drove away. I didn't go far. I literally went to the Panera Bread just outside the subdivision gates, bought an overpriced turkey club, and then sat in the parking lot with my phone propped up against the steering wheel. I had the Ring camera app open. I was watching my own empty driveway like it was the season finale of the best show on television. The Florida sun was directly overhead now, baking the asphalt. The gray epoxy on my driveway was fully cured, locked into the concrete matrix forever. The little girl and the monstrous HOA president were frozen in their standoff, a permanent monument to malicious compliance. 30 minutes passed. I finished my sandwich. I was starting to think maybe Brenda had actually listened to reason. Maybe she had Googled VARA. Maybe she had called the HOA lawyers, and they had told her to back off. Then my phone vibrated in my hand. Motion detected at front door. I tapped the notification so hard I almost cracked my screen. And the feed buffered for an agonizing second, and then the picture snapped into focus. It wasn't Brenda. It was a truck. A massive, heavy-duty, dually Ford F350 with a flatbed. And bolted to that flatbed was the biggest, meanest-looking commercial pressure washer I had ever seen. We are talking a massive diesel engine hooked up to a water tank the size of a hot tub. This wasn't the kind of machine you use to clean a patio. This was the kind of machine you use to strip paint off a battleship. The side of the truck had a giant decal, a One Extreme Blaster Company. We remove anything. And standing right there on my curb, pointing a manicured finger directly at the center of the hopscotch grid, was Brenda. I threw the SUVs into reverse. I slammed my foot on the gas. My heart was actually pounding. I know it sounds ridiculous. It's just a driveway. But if that water hit the mural before I got there, the art would be destroyed. Sure, I could sue the HOA for $150,000 under VARA, but I didn't want the money. I wanted the monument. I wanted Brenda to have to look at that mural every single day for the rest of her miserable tenure as HOA president. I took the corner onto Palmetto Park Road entirely too fast. The tires squealed. I hit the subdivision gates, punched in my resident code like a madman, and roared down the oak-lined streets. On the camera feed, I could see the contractor jumping down from the truck. He was a huge guy, wearing heavy rubber boots and ear protection around his neck. He started unspooling a thick, reinforced black hose. Brenda was standing safely on the sidewalk, arms crossed. looking incredibly smug. She was probably already mentally drafting the newsletter about how she bravely eradicated the neighborhood graffiti. I had maybe 2 minutes. I whipped onto my street. I could hear the deep, guttural roar of the pressure washer's diesel engine firing up before I even saw my house. It sounded like a jet engine spooling up. I didn't even park in the driveway, obviously. I swerved the SUV onto the grass, right onto my own perfectly manicured front lawn, throwing up a shower of dirt and perfectly cut Bermuda grass. I jammed it into park and bailed out before the engine even stopped. "Hey!" I screamed over the roar of the diesel engine. "Turn it off! Turn that off right now!" The contractor, his shirt said Big Mike, had the wand in his hand. He had his safety glasses on. He was about to squeeze the trigger. The tip of the wand was hovering maybe 2 feet above the painted face of the little girl. Mike looked up, startled by a lunatic jumping out of an SUV on the lawn. He let off the pressure. The engine idled down to a loud, chugging rumble. "What's your problem, buddy?" Mike yelled back, lifting his safety glasses. "Lady hired me to blast some graffiti. Said she represents the property." Brenda stepped forward, her face a mask of absolute, venomous triumph. "You are too late, Gasser. You abandoned the property. As HOA president, I am exercising emergency remediation protocols to remove unauthorized, unsanctioned vandalism that threatens the aesthetic integrity of Boca del Vista. Blast it, Mike." Mike looked at Brenda, then at me. He looked confused. He was just a guy trying to make a buck on a Tuesday. I walked right up to Mike, and I didn't look at Brenda. I didn't even acknowledge her existence. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a thick, folded manila envelope. "Mike," I said, pitching my voice so it carried over the engine but stayed perfectly, terrifyingly calm. "I need you to listen to me very, very carefully, because the woman standing behind you is trying to ruin your life." Mike frowned. He lowered the wand so the tip rested on the grass. "Look, man, I just do what the work order says." "I know," I interrupted. "And I don't blame you. But you are standing on my private property. I own this house. I own this driveway. And what you are looking at is not graffiti. It is a federally protected work of art." Brenda let out a shrill, hysterical laugh. "It's a picture of a brat with chalk. Blast it, Mike. I'll double your rate. I'll pay you $1,000 right now." Mike looked at the driveway. Really looked at it. For the first time, he seemed to notice the shading, the perspective, the sheer impossible detail of the piece. "I pulled this permit yesterday," I said to Mike, ignoring her entirely. "It's a legally approved decorative concrete treatment. But more importantly, it was painted last night by an internationally recognized artist." I pulled the documents out of the envelope. I had printed them at the architect firm's office 3 days ago. "This," I said, holding up the first paper, "is the Visual Artists' Rights Act of 1990. Title 17, U.S. Code, Section 106A. It is federal copyright law. It states that anyone who intentionally mutilates or destroys a work of recognized artistic stature is committing a federal offense." I held up the second piece of paper. It was a high-resolution printout of the email from Pest Control, complete with their official, authenticated digital signature and letterhead. "And this," I continued, making sure Mike could see the official seals, "is the authentication documentation proving that this specific mural is a genuine original piece by the artist known as Banksy. Do you know who that is, Mike?" Mike's eyes went wide. He wasn't an art critic, but everybody knows that name. The guy who shredded his own painting at that auction?" "Exactly," I said. "His pieces sell for anywhere from $2 to $20 million. Just the one you are standing on is currently appraising around $3 million. Under federal law, the artist, not me, but the artist and his legal team, can sue the person who destroys his work for statutory damages of $150,000, plus the actual value of the art. I stepped a little closer to Mike. I pointed directly at the massive pressure washer. "If you squeeze that trigger, Mike," I said, my voice dead serious. "If one single drop of 4,000 psi water touches that epoxy, Brenda isn't going to pay the bill. The HOA isn't going to protect you. The artist's legal team, which is based in London and has unlimited resources, will name your company A1 Extreme Blaster Company in a federal lawsuit. They will seize your truck. They will seize your house. Yet you will be paying off a $3 million judgment for the rest of your natural life because you listened to a woman with a clipboard." Mike looked at the paper. He looked at the mural. He looked at the wand in his hand like it had suddenly turned into a live rattlesnake. "It's a trick!" Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking into a terrifying falsetto. "He printed that off the internet. It's fake. I am the president of this association. I order you to clean this driveway." Mike slowly turned around to look at Brenda. He reached up, grabbed his ear protection, and threw it into the cab of his truck. He walked over to the massive diesel engine and hit the kill switch. The silence that fell over the street was deafening. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. "Lady," Mike said, his voice heavy with disgust, "I wash driveways. Yet I wash gutters. I don't mess with federal law, and I sure as hell don't mess with million-dollar paintings. You're out of your mind." He started walking backward, reeling the heavy black hose back onto the truck's spool as fast as his arms could move. "Mike, you have a contract!" Brenda screamed, actually stomping her tennis shoe on the sidewalk. "I will leave a terrible review. I will ruin your business." "Leave a review!" Mike yelled back, throwing the wand into the bed of the truck and slamming the tailgate. "Tell him a one blasting doesn't commit federal crimes for crazy HOA, ladies. Keep your $1,000. He jumped into the driver's seat, fired up the huge Ford, and tore out of the cul-de-sac so fast he left black tire marks on the asphalt. And then there were two. Brenda and me. She was standing on the edge of my property line. While she was breathing hard, her chest heaving under her pastel pink tracksuit, she looked from the retreating truck to the mural, and finally to me. The absolute panic was finally starting to bleed through her anger. She realized what had just happened. She had pushed all her chips to the center of the table, and I had just flipped the board. I walked down my driveway, making a point to step very carefully around the painted hopscotch grid until I was standing right in front of her. I pulled one last document out of the envelope. "This one is for you, Brenda," I said, holding out a thick stack of legal paper stapled into a blue backing. She didn't take it. She just stared at it like it was radioactive. "Since you won't take it, consider yourself served," I said, dropping the papers onto the grass at her feet. "That is a formal cease and desist order drafted by my attorney, Marcus Vance. It has been filed with the county clerk. It explicitly names you, Brenda, in your personal capacity and the entire Boca del Vista Homeowners Association." I leaned in a little. I wanted her to hear every single word. It outlines the VARA statutes. It outlines the authentication of the artwork, and it clearly states that if any member of the HOA board, any contractor hired by the HOA, or any resident acting on your behalf so much as touches this property with a scrub brush, we will initiate immediate, devastating litigation. We're talking asset seizure, Brenda. We're talking freezing the HOA accounts. We're talking the neighborhood losing the clubhouse, the tennis courts, and the pool just to pay the legal fees. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out, and her jaw just worked uselessly up and down. "You wanted to enforce the rules, Brenda," I said softly. "You wanted to write a citation for a 6-year-old playing with chalk. Well, congratulations. You enforced them. You got exactly what you asked for. A grayscale, decorative, chemically sealed concrete treatment, and now you get to look at it every single time you walk out your front door. Forever. I turned my back on her. I walked up my driveway, up the steps and onto my porch. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I heard the frantic, squeaking sound of her tennis shoes as she practically ran back to her house. I heard her front door slam so hard the glass rattled. The aftermath was honestly the best part. By the weekend, the story had leaked. I didn't call the news, but someone did. Probably Gary. Within 48 hours, there were local news vans parked on Palmetto Park Road. The drone footage of the mural made the front page of the Miami Herald. Art critics from New York were flying down just to stand on the sidewalk and take pictures of my house. My driveway literally became a local tourist attraction. People would drive by slowly, rolling their windows down, laughing when they saw the caricature of the angry woman with the clipboard. And the best part? Every Saturday morning, without fail, I would take Chloe outside. We would bring out a brand new bucket of Crayola washable street chalk, and she would draw bright, neon pink and green unicorns right inside the hyper-realistic $3 million hopscotch grid. Nobody ever complained. Nobody ever called the police. Brenda didn't leave her house for a week. When she finally did, she refused to look across the street. She walked with her head down. 2 weeks later, there was a quiet, unceremonious email sent out to the entire neighborhood. Brenda had resigned from the HOA board, citing personal health reasons. The new president, a very relaxed guy named Dave, who liked to barbecue in his front yard, immediately waived my original $500 fine and officially reclassified my driveway as a neighborhood cultural asset. It was a total, unmitigated victory. We didn't just beat the system, we permanently altered the landscape of the system. Remember, folks, when they try to rewrite the rules, you don't just break them, you paint over them. Stay sovereign, stay legally compliant, and I'll see you in the next one.